All right, well, welcome everybody. Hopefully you had some brain lubricant in the form of alcohol or something with your dinner so we can have some fun here. So the goal of this session is for you to end up with a sort of practical working knowledge of what goes into an open source license and why a developer would choose a particular license and how those things affect you when you want to use open source software. How many of you already work on open source software regularly? Okay, a few. And the rest of you probably have it in your code base, in your organization, all that kind of stuff, but you don't necessarily work on it regularly. So, all right. So, oh, come on. Battery must be low. So this was the title that I gave to our internal review team when I told them I was going to do a presentation like this, so that they would know what it was going to be about. This is more like, you know, your syllabus you see when you're going to college and you're going to sign up for this lecture and all that kind of stuff. It's actually not. Actually, the last part of that's true. The rest of that, yeah, forget it. So, all right, we have to do the obligatory misspelling of lawyer. Layware, it's close enough. Got the right letters. We have to do the obligatory things. I'm not a lawyer, don't want to be a lawyer. You're probably not lawyers either, although given that this is CppCon, there are some people here who deem themselves language lawyers, but that's not really relevant. We can say we're not attorneys, that's a little clearer. None of this is legal advice. Don't try to rely on it that way. If you have attorneys available, they tend to enjoy liquor. If you want to ask them questions, that's a good way to go about that. So, all right. I think I probably already covered some of this, but yeah. So you've probably all looked at one point or another some open source licenses, one or more open source licenses. You've seen that some of them are really short, like 2 or 3 paragraphs, and the paragraphs are not particularly long, although even in those short licenses, one of the paragraphs is in all uppercase, which tends to make things very scary, and lawyers do that on purpose. Some of them are long, page or two. Some of them are really long, like the GPL v3 and AGPL v3 are really long. In spite of all of that, you can actually think about them much like software itself. So licenses aren't created in a vacuum, just like software is not created in a vacuum. When you are going to write a program to try to accomplish some task, there are requirements, things that the program must do to achieve its end. There are constraints. It's going to run on a particular kind of computer. It's going to run on a particular kind of operating system. It's going to take input in a particular way. All these kinds of things influence how you go about writing the software. That is true for licenses as well. Some of those things, for example, are the law is not the same in every part of the world. So while copyright law is fairly consistent around most of the world, except for a couple of countries like China and a couple other places, it's fairly consistent around the world, and yet there are still differences. Those end up being constraints. Requirements are the things we're going to talk about here. The goals, what you want the license to achieve if you were to write one. In this case, we're going to pick one. And interestingly enough, just like in C++ land, if you don't follow the rules and you try to run the program anyway, you get what we like to call undefined behavior in C++ land. Or if it's really nice to you, you get exceptions instead. That's true in the legal world too. It isn't possible for a license, just like it isn't possible for a program, to predict every eventuality, every environment it might find itself in. And that means that the results of using the license may not have been what you expected. So we are going to do just a little bit of legal stuff because all of these licenses are based on something called copyrights. Anybody here ever studied copyright law? No raising of hands. Good. That means I can tell you whatever I want to tell you. So copyrights are actually fairly simple. If you imagine hundreds and hundreds of years ago, let's say at least 500 years ago, or maybe at least 300 years ago. Tom hasn't told me when this actually happened. Somewhere between 300 and 600 years ago. There wasn't much of a legal system anywhere in the world, although the English kind of led the way there. And people that created things, think of composers that wrote music, artists that painted paintings, sculptors that sculpted things, whatever it is that they make. they did what they did. I mean, we've always had people that did creative things and produced things for either their own benefit or the benefit of their community or whatever that might be. There were no legal structures in place to protect the things that they were doing. Now, for some things, it doesn't matter that much. I mean, if I go take a huge block of marble and I do what the sculptors say, I carve away all the pieces that aren't the sculpture and I'm left with the sculpture, that's cool. You can all come and look at it. It's a little difficult for you to copy it, though. You'd have to be able to do basically the same things I did to result in making a copy that people would accept as a copy of my sculpture. But think about music. That's not true. Or a book, once the printing press was invented. That's not really true. I mean, if I write a piece of music and write it down on a piece of paper, if you have some mechanism of copying that, even if it's by hand, I mean, sheet music for a song might only be 3 or 4 pages, you could copy that and then claim it was yours. And prior to the existence of copyrights, there was literally nothing to stop you from doing that. There was no legal impediment to you doing that. So you could find that someone had written a piece of music that you really liked, and people were paying them to perform it. They liked it so much that people were actually asking them to come to pubs or whatever and paying them to perform this music. And you go, gosh, I can make money if I did that, so I'm just going to take a copy of the music and go do it myself. And there was actually nothing to stop anybody from doing that. Well, this causes a problem. People that like to do these things would like their efforts to be rewarded in some way. Now, if you're a creative person, sometimes the reward is just the satisfaction of having created, right? And the satisfaction of other people appreciating what you've created. But in other cases, you'd actually like to be compensated in some way. Maybe it's not money. Maybe you're a benefactor, which was the case for a lot of artists hundreds of years ago, would, give you room and board, give you a place to stay and food, and you continue to paint, or you continue to sculpt, or you compose music, or whatever it is. You're being compensated in some way. But if your work ends up having no value because other people can just copy it at will and there's literally nothing you can do about it, you're probably going to become disillusioned by that and do something else. So whoever it was, king, courts, whatever, created this thing called copyright. And it's really quite simple to understand. I don't know if I have it on the next slide or not. Yes, I do. Woohoo! Yay. Anytime you have some form of creative expression of any idea, by default, you own that. So if you go write a poem, or you write a program, which it wasn't always the case, but it is now, or you paint a painting, or you write some music, or whatever, by default, you own that work. You get to control what is done with it or not done with it. By default, no one else can do anything with it. It is yours. You have sole control over anything that would be considered making a copy of it. Now, obviously, if you go stick it up on a wall and someone walks by and looks at the painting or reads the poem or reads the sheet music, well, that's not copying. They're just looking at it. That's perfectly fine. But the most important things, and especially when we're getting into software land, involve copying. You get to control that. Now, as I mentioned, this is a law that was created. I'll have to go find out who created it. But unlike, say, the law of gravity, which we kind of all understand, it's a natural law, copyrights are not a natural law. Now, natural laws we can test, right? We can test whether gravity is operating and to what extent it's operating and the effects that things that we do may have on that, and run experiments and come up with an analysis and say, oh, well, if you have this incredibly strong magnetic field polarized in just the right way and the material, blah, 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 gravity is reduced by 5%, and we can prove that to ourselves by doing experiments. We can't do any of that with the legal system. There is no experimentation, at least not in any practical way, which means when someone writes a law, whether a government writes a law or something is decided as part of a court decision or someone writes a contract or whatever, it is, to put a better way, it's a theory. It expresses the intent, but there is actually no way to test it except in individual circumstances, which is unfortunate because it means when you go to, say, the attorneys in your company, as Bjarne was telling me about earlier, and you say, hey, I want to use this piece of software. and here's the license, and here's where I got the software from, and here's who claims the copyright holders are, and this is what I want to do with it. I want to include it in this program that we're about to ship to 100 million people. They're going to deliver it through the, you work for Microsoft, so you wouldn't deliver it through the App Store or the Google Play Store. Maybe you would, whatever. Can I do that? Now, as a software developer, you're used to things being pretty much black and white. There's a way to arrive at a yes or no answer to almost everything. And the lawyers will tell you that if you need an explicit, conclusive answer, the answer is going to be no. They'll actually do that without even reading the license. And the reason for that is they cannot tell you yes without there being some element of risk involved. Their job is to minimize risk for you, for your company, whatever that might be. And knowing how you're going to use it, what the license says, who the copyright holders are, how they've acted in the past, are there unknown? I mean, it's just this huge situation. And so they're going to say, all right, well, how much are we going to charge for this software? How many people are going to have it? How many other things are going to be in? And they'll end up doing a risk calculation and deciding whether it's acceptable to do it or not. It's still not a concrete answer. This is very unfortunate for those of us who are software developers because they can't ever say, yes, this is good, no, this is, well, sometimes they can absolutely say, no, this is bad. I'll stick a slight diversion because we're not going to talk about individual licenses here, but in one of the other training sessions that I do, we talk about the various kinds of open source licenses that exist and what's good and bad about various ones and what makes a license considered to be open source. There's a checklist of criteria that it must meet. And one of those criteria is that it cannot, I'll use the legally words, it cannot distinguish against fields of use. Which means, in layman's terms, you can't tell someone what they can or cannot use your software for if you license it under one of these open source licenses. Which may very well mean that people use software that you've published on the internet under an open source license for things that you would really wish they wouldn't use it for, like building weapon systems or doing other things. And so there is a license out there. I've seen 3 instances of it now on 3 different projects that has a stipulation in it says the software must be used for good and not for evil. Now, as a developer, you read that and go, ha, 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 that's funny. And the lawyer looks at that and goes, oh, crap. Who decides what's evil and what's good? No, the risk here is too high. Whoever wrote this software and published it might decide that running a bank or selling coffee or whatever it is that we do in our business is evil, and then they're going to sue us and make us stop doing whatever it is that we've been doing. No, run away, run as far away as you can. There is some times when they'll just say blanket absolutely no. So, all right, let's get out of the legal stuff. Now we're going to have a story, and you guys are going to help me a little bit here, and there aren't that many of you, so you're going to have to be brave and help. So I'm not going to pick anybody out of the crowd to be this person, although if I was going to, it's Charles, because I know Charles. But I'm not going to make him do it anyway. So imagine we have a hypothetical developer named Bob. You can see a little bit about Bob's story there. Bob's going to be the protagonist of our little exploration that we have here tonight. And you can see a little bit of his backstory. You've all read that. I'm going to move on to the next one because the remote has to be over here. So Bob's a smart guy. He really likes math. He really likes analyzing things and coming up with formulas to describe them and express them. He just really, really does. You know, there are people like that. Most of us are probably not like that. Well, some people write software like that too. And so Bob has decided that he's going to do this kind of stuff. So this is the subject of Bob's master's thesis. I'll give you a second to read that. He's combining a few fields of study here in his thesis. Probably as a result, no one has ever published a master's thesis like this before. So that's good for him because his defense is going to be a little bit easier. So, all right, so we understand what Bob is trying to accomplish here. Now, for him to actually do something, and this is actually common in a lot of master's programs now, especially in computer science land, you have your paper that you defend, but then you've also implemented software along the way to actually prove that whatever theory, algorithm, whatever it is that you've come up with does actually work. And of course, Bob's done that too. So he's got a library that he's written that does these calculations. Takes some input, produces some output, lets you do the right thing. Great. We've all done that sort of thing, right? So let's start with the questions. Let's assume for the moment that this library is short enough that you could print it on a couple of pieces of paper and it'd be readable and legible and understandable and all of that, and they could be posted on a bulletin board, all right? So Bob has done that. Can someone take that printed copy of the code from the bulletin board? Anybody want to venture a guess? Nobody's being brave? Bjarna's got his hand up.
Oh, I was going to say, in the corner of the bulletin board is saying this is going to be cleaned up every first.
That's true. That's true. Let's assume that that's not the case, but you're right, yes. The simple story. Charles is walking by, he looks at this and he goes, wow, that's really cool. And he yanks it off the bulletin board. Can he do that? Sure he can do that, because that has nothing to do with copyright at all. That's theft. Those pieces of paper were Bob's property. Now, he may not have labeled them that way, but that's also part of the law. Things that are your property, whether you put stickers on them to say your property or not. If I go over there and take Charles's wallet, he can still say it's his, even though it doesn't say property of Charles Bailey. Well, actually, it might. But if it doesn't say that, it doesn't matter. It's still his property. So that was a little curveball. All right. Now, let's make sure, yeah. All right. So let's get a little trickier. These are going to get trickier as we go on, so you're going to have to pay attention, right? All right. So you can't just take it. I mean, you can take it, but that's not nice because that's theft. And you don't want to be so obvious anyway, right? You don't want Bob to walk by the next day and go, what happened to my code? It's not on the bulletin board anymore. So you say, aha, well, there's a room right across the hall that has a photocopier. So if I just take these off the bulletin board real quick and I go around to the photocopier and make a copy and then put them back, no one will ever know. I'll even put the pins right back in the same holes, so nobody will know that I took it off.
Just as an aside, that's not theft, because under English law anyway, because if you don't have the intent to permanently deprive Bob of his pieces of paper,
correct.
Then that's not
correct, theft. Right, yeah. So this one's not theft. We've established that actually even in the US this is not theft either. But Bob owns the copyright on his code. So can you do that? Are you legally, now when I say can, I'm going to say this throughout the whole thing. Interpret when I say can as, are you legally permitted to do so? As opposed to, are you physically capable of doing so? Which is a completely valid interpretation of the word can, but not what I'm asking here. So, and it would be much longer if I put that in every time. So, can someone do that? See one head shaking and another one. You're correct. No. Nothing gave you permission to do that. The fact that it's published, stuck on a bulletin board, I'm not going to use the word published, that's different. Stuck on a bulletin board in a public place in no way gives you any rights to do anything. You can read it, because it's there. You put it there for reading, and clearly, if Bob somehow wanted to make the claim that you reading it was, offensive to him or in violation of his rights or something and tried to take that to a court, they would say, well, then why'd you put it on the bulletin board if you didn't want anybody to read it? So that's pretty clear. But no, he did not give you permission to do that. All right, first part of copyright. We've got that part. Everybody understands. All right. Now, this is a little trickier one, but this comes up a lot. So a bunch of students are walking by this hallway all day long because, it's a hallway in and out of the building. It's the computer science building, and a bunch of them see this code. And then, since we're in Seattle, they're all hanging out at a Starbucks or a Tully's or whatever that night. And someone says, hey, did you see that code that was up on the bulletin board today? He goes, oh, yeah. Are they allowed to talk about it? Yes, they are. And that is, and this is why none of us are lawyers here, this is, first of all, not copying. Actually, I will stop there because that's a simpler one. That's not copying. Nobody copied anything. Now, you could, if you wanted to be as pedantic as it's possible to be pedantic, say that, in fact, there is a copy in their brain. Because otherwise, they wouldn't be able to talk about it. They wouldn't know what they saw. There must be some copy. The law does not cover that. Putting a copy in your brain is completely allowed. All right. So they're talking about it at the coffee shop. And because this is a coffee shop near a campus and there's a bunch of geeks and stuff, there's whiteboards at this coffee shop because, why not? You have whiteboards at the coffee shop. And they're talking about it and someone goes, I don't remember that part. That part you're talking about where he did that calculation, I don't remember that. And they say, oh, hang on. And they walk up to the whiteboard and they write down 3 lines of code that they remember from that stuff that they saw on the bulletin board. What do you think about that? Allowed? Not allowed. See, a no, a solid no, a couple of quasi-yeses, maybe 3 quasi-yeses, and then a no. Guess what? This is actually allowed. Because copyright law has something called the fair use exception. Generally speaking, that's not actually something you're going to have to deal with open source licenses, but it is something you have to deal with just in general reading software. The fair use exception exists for a number of reasons. It exists to cover things like, let's say, writing a review of a play. And maybe there was one line from a character in the play that the reviewer found particularly compelling, and that it would make writing the story of the review of the play much better if they were to include it. They're allowed to include it. Now, they can't include 10 minutes of dialogue from the play. That goes way beyond fair use. But you can do it for describing something that you saw, or study. In this case, this would qualify under study because this is a discussion group studying the code and talking about the code. And there are some other things too. It even applies to music. Originally, when there started to be lots of sampling of songs and putting little 2-second and 3-second snippets into other songs, then people got sued for copyright violations for doing that, and they said, no, that's fair use because it's only 3 seconds. And then the judges said, but you're doing it for commercial purposes. How is making another song and selling it on albums and getting paid for it? That's not study, that's not description or whatever. So that exists, and it does apply in cases where, for example, you're browsing the internet and you're just reading someone's code. Even though that code may be published in a way that says you have no rights to it whatsoever, which in legal land says all rights reserved, which is the default anyway, if they've published it, put it out on a website that's not protected in any way, anyone can see it, it's perfectly fine for you to read it, for you to talk to your friends about it, for you to even write up a review of it and say, wow, I saw this really awesome code. But you can't go much further than that. So that's that. At least you know that exists. It will occasionally come up. Yeah, because it depends on your use. If your use ends up being commercial, like you're incorporating into this application we're talking about that you're going to put on somebody's phone and sell it to them, or even if you're going to give it to them for no money, it might still be commercial use, and then that's not fair use because it's commercial use. So, well, that's a different story. That covers patents, and we're not going to talk about patents because patents are super scary, and I'm not a lawyer. So, all right. So, now this person, this evil person, who I haven't given a name to, maybe I should give this evil person a name to, a subjectively evil person a name, says, all right. Fine. I'm going to make a copy, but I'm just going to keep the copy for myself. No one's ever going to see it. I'm not going to use it anyway. I'm not going to sell it. I'm not going to make further copies of it. Nothing. What do you say? Allowed? Not allowed? A squinty eye up here. I'm not sure if that's a yes or a no. So no. It's still copying. Even though you got no benefit from the copy, you don't plan to get any benefit from the copy, you're not making further copies or whatever. You could, in this case, say the copy literally has no purpose at all because you did not benefit from it in any way. You still can't do it. Copyrights say you cannot make a copy, period. All right, now it gets more interesting. So Bob has had this code posted on the bulletin board for a while. And people have come up to him and said, hey, that looks really interesting, but I can't do anything with it because, it's It's on paper. I mean, I can't run it on my computer and try it out or anything. If your goal was to get people to be inspired to try to use this, you're not accomplishing anything, because all we can do is read it and talk about it. We can't make any copies of it. I can't put it on my computer to try it. And Bob says, oh, okay, fine. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, that was kind of dumb of me. So he comes in the next day with a copy of the code on a flash drive, and he gives it to this person who now is probably not subjectively evil anymore. They're trying to do good things. So he gives that person the flash drive with the code on it. And what question do I have on here? Same thing. Same question as the last time, except now they were given the code on a flash drive instead of on paper. Actually, they were given the code. That's actually an important point here. They were given the code on a flash drive as opposed to be just hung up on the wall on a piece of paper. Does that change their legal rights as far as making copies go? No, it does not. Again, they don't have any permission. Now, Bob gave them the copy on the flash drive, which is could be an important distinction if it ever came down to it. Unfortunately, it doesn't. I mean, there's rare cases where it might. In this case, it does not. You can give someone a copy of something that you hold the copyright on, and if it does not have any license, didn't give them permission to do anything, they literally cannot do anything with it. Anybody want to hypothesize a very, very, very well-known website on the internet where this kind of thing happens all the time? Starts with a G, ends with a B, and it sounds like it-ha in the middle. If you go to GitHub, there are literally millions of repositories there with no copyright or license notice at all. Now, you can see them even though you don't have rights to copy the code, because GitHub does. When you create a GitHub account, probably no one ever does do this part, but during the process of creating a GitHub account, there's pages and pages of terms of service and legal agreements that you are agreeing to by use of the GitHub service. If you create an account and then push code to a repository on GitHub, you are agreeing to their terms of service. And one section of their terms of service says they have permission to take any code that you've uploaded to GitHub and republish it out to the world. So GitHub is perfectly within their rights. Even though you didn't write any license or anything in your code, you've given them a license to do this. Nobody else has one. So if you're up there on GitHub going, wow, that is really an awesome piece of code, I want to use that, you go talk to their lawyers and they'll say, what's the license on it? Well, it doesn't have one. Stop looking at it. That's the answer you'll get. Stop looking at it. We would prefer you not even read that code. It's too late, you already have. But if we had a little Men in Black flashy thing to make you forget that you'd ever read the code, we would, because we would prefer that you'd never read it at all. So, all right. This is an interesting one. Yeah, all right. That's what I thought it was. All right, same situation. Bob gives somebody a copy of the code on a flash drive. Now, what's a flash drive's intended purpose? It's intended to be plugged into a computer so that you can get the contents of it and do something with them, right? So if you give somebody some code on a flash drive, it's probably pretty likely that your expectation is, or their expectation is, that you're giving that to them for the purpose of them to do something with it, probably to run it. Now, in the case of C++, it has to be compiled, but let's skip over that. That doesn't really affect copyright at all, at least not primarily here. So, anybody want to guess whether code on a flash drive that has no license statement whatsoever, whether you're allowed to run it on your computer? We have a no, we have a yes, we have another yes, we have a hand. Oh, we have a thumbs down, and we have a yes. Well, and this slide may actually be wrong. Ha! It is wrong. I have to fix this. So, those of you that said no, you probably said no because of the reasoning that I have right here on this slide. He says no for a different reason.
Yeah, because you may not have been, you may have been given the right to copy it, but you've not been given the right to perform it, if you will. Kind of like with music, you may not have been
Correct.
given the right to perform it.
Well, and that's the reason that this slide is wrong. Because there have been multiple court cases now that say the purpose of computer software is for it to be executed by a computer. Which means if you give somebody a copy of it, even though you don't give them permission to make further copies of it, and even though executing it on their computer technically does make further copies of it, it copies it into the memory of the computer and may do other things, all of that is allowed because it's software. Its purpose in existence is to be run on a computer. So it's completely reasonable for someone who obtains a copy of software, even though it doesn't have a license statement, to use it. Only use. Doesn't go any further than that. And I originally thought that was not the case, and then it was brought to my attention that, in fact, it is the case. And at least in the US, I'm talking mostly about US law here. There's probably comparable cases in some other major jurisdictions. At least in the US, use is absolutely allowed. All right. So now Bob's got himself a, yeah, go ahead.
So does that mean if I am given a copy of a piece of music, I'm also allowed to perform that piece of music?
On your own. You can't do a public performance of it. But you can, say, perform it in your living room if you like.
So I can only run it on a computer in private?
Sure. Probably. Yeah. If you were to use it for commercial purposes, for example, or anything that could be deemed commercial purposes, that use permission could potentially be negated by a judge. They might say, yeah, you shouldn't have done that.
But if it was a display program that I used to present my slides for a talk in public.
Sure. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely right.
Yes, what? Yes, that's
Yes, it's okay. It's just okay for you to do that. Yep. Yep. So, yes. Well, so the difference between copyrights and IP, IP is not a thing. IP is a collection of things. So copyrights are one form of intellectual property. Patents are another form of intellectual property. Trade secrets are another form of intellectual property. So are trademarks, and there are probably some others, but those are the major ones that most people come across. So we're assuming throughout this whole discussion that the code that Bob has written does not have any of those other kinds of intellectual property in it. Because if it did, the licensing things we're about to talk about wouldn't be adequate. We're going to assume for the moment that the only intellectual property rights that exist in this software that Bob has written are his copyrights. If, for example, he also patented the algorithm, which may be possible in the place where he lives, then that completely upends the whole discussion because the license would have to be very different since it's a patented algorithm and it's an implementation of a patented algorithm. If Bob has given a really cool name to his library and then registered that trademark in 65 countries around the world or something, that also affects the license because now your ability to use it may be impacted by the fact that it has a trademark name and you don't have permission to use the trademark without a trademark license. That's all other kinds of stuff. Yeah. And I was assuming that you meant IP, intellectual property, not IP, Internet Protocol. Good. So all right. So now people come back to Bob and say, well, this is really cool that you're giving us copies on a flash drive, except all we can do is use it on our computers. We can't give other copies to people. We can't make backups of it or anything. So again, Bob is not achieving his purpose here. He wants to get this code out so people will use it so that this problem of having too much ketchup on French fries will be solved. So what does Bob need to do? What have we all learned that Bob needs to do?
He needs to grant some sort of license.
He needs to give people permission to copy it. So, actually, yeah, exactly what I said. Bob is going to have to grant others permission to copy his library. This is done by providing them a license, as Charles just said. So, Bob says, and this slide may, yeah, we're not going to remove that slide because use we already know is covered. And I already talked about this. But I'll cover it here again anyway, just because it is important. What if Bob doesn't want people to use his code for illegal activities? Now, granted, it's pretty hard to imagine an algorithm that computes the amount of ketchup that should go on French fries being used for illegal activities. But we're creative people. Maybe it's possible that it could be used that way. And Bob says, hey, I'm giving this away for free. I don't want people using this for illegal stuff. That's not fair. I mean, they should at least pay me for it if they're going to use it for illegal things. So yeah. Well, here's the problem. that's not an objective determination. It's a subjective determination, right? The decision about whether something is illegal activity depends on, I don't know, the laws in the area where it happened, and the intent of the people that did whatever it was, and interpretation by attorneys and judges and maybe a jury and a bunch of other stuff. So that's not an experimentally testable thing, which means you can't just point to somewhere over there and say that's the list of illegal activities, because everything will be subject to interpretation. So, since Bob is the copyright holder, who gets the pleasant enjoyment of having to do all of the interpretation to decide whether your use of his library constitutes a valid use or not? Bob. It's a bad choice on his part if he wants to do that, because he's going to be burdened with having to do that. Now, in reality, no one actually tries, well, except for the licenses that say no usage for evil and a couple other things, no one really tries to get away with that. For a couple of reasons. Number one, they don't want to be in a position of having to do that. Number two, there is this thing I've mentioned in passing, this list of criteria for whether a license is deemed to be open source or not, and one of them is you can't do this. You just can't, you can't discriminate about the way people are using your software. All right. So, we've determined that Bob wants to let people not only use his library, but make copies to give to other people. So that adds some questions. Number one, in the library, it says, written by Bob. We don't know what Bob's last name is, but assume it's in there. So, if someone's going to distribute a copy of the library, do they have to keep Bob's name attached to it? Interesting question, because the law doesn't actually say one way or the other. If he gives them permission to distribute copies of it, they might not have to keep his name attached to it if they don't want to, although technically they probably have to copy it in its exact form. But this is something that you will see in open source licenses, even in the very shortest ones, and this is called attribution. This is basically ensuring that if someone distributes a copy of software that you have published under a license, that they don't get to claim that they wrote it. That they have to keep evidence in there that you are the copyright holder and you are the one that granted the permission to copy it. Okay? That's pretty simple. Now, if someone takes that code off the flash drive and says, man, this is really cool, except I don't like ketchup. I like mustard, and I don't like French fries, I like hot dogs. So I'm going to modify, because everybody knows you never put ketchup on a hot dog, by the way. So I'm going to modify this library so that it works for calculating the amount of mustard you should put on a hot dog instead of the amount of ketchup you should put on a French fry, which is going to be slightly different, but some of it's going to be similar. So they've changed the code and they want to distribute it. Does Bob still want his name on that? If any of you are Bob, what do you think? Got a kind of a shaky yes back there. That's a decision that Bob gets to make. There isn't anything in the law that says one way or the other. Most likely, the code still contains significant portions that Bob wrote originally. So he still has the copyright on those. Even though the person who modified it also has copyright in this library, they have copyright on the parts that they changed and anything they made significant changes to. So this is another thing that you will see in open source licenses. If you're going to distribute copies, you may not only be required to maintain the names of the copyright holders and whoever it was that granted you the license in the first place, you may also be obligated to indicate, if you have made any changes, which files you've changed and when. Now, there are a number of very prominent licenses, including the GPL and others, that have these sorts of requirements in them. They are probably the least enforced requirements in any open source license. I mean, I don't know that I've ever seen a GPL licensed project that I know has been modified by someone actually contain indications of the modifications that they've made. That's becoming a little bit less of a concern now that public code hosting has become so pervasive and so it's free. I mean, free, you don't have to pay for it. So it's usually quite easy to find the original version of some library from wherever it came from and then go find out what was changed and go from there. But this is a decision that the person who's deciding the license on their code gets to make. And the reason for that is, what if the changes are terrible? What if they break it? Like, it doesn't work anymore, or worse, it invokes undefined behavior and it formats your hard drive every time you run the code or whatever. Bob is probably not going to want his name associated with that. And this is especially true for situations where, like, companies are publishing software under an open source license. They have a reputation to protect. They probably have shareholders and lots of other things, and they have an obligation to their shareholders to protect their reputation. So there may very well be very explicit statements in the license that say you must do this, and if you don't do this, we can actually revoke your permission to distribute copies at all, because you're distributing copies and leaving our name in and not telling people that you modified it. So, and I think I just covered that. Yeah. All right. So here's a fun one. So Bob has just given you a copy, given everyone, a copy of this code in C++. It's nice and readable, got great comments. Formatting's beautiful, which whatever formatting style everyone here prefers, because you probably all have your own. It's great. And someone says, yeah, but this is too big. I don't like all this white space and these comments and all this crap. I'm just going to mash it all together in one file, and I'm going to remove all the white space that the compiler will let me remove, because it's still going to compile exactly the same. It's going to run exactly the same, and I want to do all of that. So what if they want to do that and distribute those versions? Is that okay? I have a yes. All right. So this, first of all, counts as modification, clearly, right? I mean, this is not in the form that they originally received it. There's another issue here, though. If you received the original copy of the code, you'd be able to read it, presumably, study it, hopefully understand how it works, and decide if you want to modify it or use it or whatever. But if you receive this version where everything's been collapsed down to one line that you can't even read in your editor because it's 7 million columns long, that's not very friendly for you to actually be able to study or do anything with, is it? I mean, it's not as bad as you only getting a binary version, but it's headed in that direction. So this may very well be something that Bob wants to protect against. He might want to say, all right, you can use my code. You can make copies of my code and give those to other people. You can modify my code and make copies of the modified version and give those to other people. All that's fine. I have no problem with any of that, as long as you keep my name in and you mark your changes and all the other stuff we've talked about. But if you do something crazy like this, I'm going to make you have to give everybody an original copy, a friendly copy, a preferred form for editing copy, which is a language that you see in the GPL. Because I gave you this for free. You're benefiting from it in some way, or otherwise you wouldn't be going through all this effort of producing this modified version and redistributing it. And in return for the benefits you're gaining, I'm asking you to do a couple of things. And this is one of the first places, it may be the first place, where copyright law is actually being used to make someone do something they would not otherwise have had to do. If you think about it originally, copyrights just control giving people permission to do things that they want to do, right? If they want to make copies, you can give them permission to make copies or not. They want to make modified copies and distribute those. You can give them permission to make modified copies or not. Those are all decisions you get to make as a copyright holder. In this case, you can say, I'm giving you provisional permission. You can make modifications to this code and you can distribute those modifications if you like. But if you do, you also have to distribute the code in, we'll say, its original form or something similar to that. So that people who receive this bizarre version that you've created, which you claim is better, will also have the original one and they can study it. This is also a very important aspect of a bunch of open source licenses, the ones that are classified as copyleft licenses, which we won't go into a lot of details here. But the GPL is definitely one of those. And this, of course, extends to the ultimate obfuscation, which is compiling the code into machine code, into a shared object or a DLL or whatever other form you want to distribute it in, and then just giving someone a copy of the binary. Those licenses, their intent, one of their stated intents, is to ensure that the software that was distributed under them stays free. That whatever permissions you got, he gets, and he gets, and he gets, and he gets. Even if you decide you want to distribute a binary version, you can't take away those freedoms. And the license enforces that by saying, if you give him a binary, you must also make the source code available. And when he receives the source code from you, it will be under the same license, which means if you've modified it, your modifications are also under that license. You may or may not have heard of the GPL referred to as a viral license and other somewhat nasty ways of saying it. This is one aspect of that. It stops you. It's intentionally stopping you from making proprietary changes to that code and then keeping them proprietary. Yes?
So with a proprietary version of the code, say, you took Bob's library and you wrote some code around it and obfuscated it by compiling it down to one binary. Would that be a modification of his code?
So his question is basically around combination of the code that was under the GPL, for example, or in whatever license it is, and code that you wrote. By every interpretation that I'm aware of, that constitutes modification. So it would trigger whatever modification requirements are in the license that you got the original code under. So, and depending on that license, you may be not obligated to do anything at all. If it's a very permissive license, which is why they're called permissive, you may be obligated to only distribute the source code of the parts that were not yours, that you originally got under whatever license you got them under, and there's a whole class of licenses that fall into that category. Or it may be something as extreme as the GPL, which says, guess what? The source code for the whole thing has to be distributed, and all of it has to be under this license. And that's what the GPL is for. That's what it was its purpose. And so that one of the aspects of that is, conceivably, someone who accidentally incorporates GPL licensed software into some package and then distributes the binaries with the expectation that they'd be able to keep their additional stuff that they wrote around it all secret, won't be able to, because the license would force them to publish it all. All right, so Bob has a license, and we're not talking about a specific license here, we're just talking about in generalities. He's allowed copying. He has allowed required attribution, which is good. At least he's decided that he wants attribution. He could have decided he didn't want attribution, although I'm not aware of any licenses where that's not required. And he's decided that if you distribute the code, you must distribute it in a friendly form. Everybody understand what we've covered here? That all kind of makes sense to you? We've just described the GPL, minus a whole bunch of other stuff, which is why it's so long. These are the important things of any copyleft style license, which the GPL is called, which is the family of licenses the GPL lands in. These are the most important things. The next one goes beyond this, which I'm not going to try to talk about here because it's way too in-depth. But it goes into things like combination, linking, a bunch of other stuff, where the GPL makes an express effort to do things like, say, you took Bob's code and you compiled it into a shared object, and then you wrote some code of your own, and you compiled that into an executable, and the executable links to that shared object at runtime. You didn't combine the source code together in any way. The GPL still covers, or wants to, and in some cases does, cover even that situation, where the combination of all of those things occurs on the end user's computer at runtime, not in the way it was distributed. And it takes advantage of another part of copyright law, which we're not going to get into because it requires lawyers, and we're not going to talk about that, but it's derivatives and a bunch of other stuff. So, anybody have any questions about any of that stuff? Because this is the end of my slides, so now we can just talk about whatever we want to talk about. Because I think, yeah, that's where I left it. The point here is that all of the stuff that you see in licenses basically boils, the parts that will most affect you boil down to those three questions. Are you allowed to copy the code at all? Do you have to maintain notices of who wrote it and who gave you the term, license, and all that kind of stuff? And will you be obligated to publish the source code of the thing that you got originally if what you're normally publishing is something else, an obfuscated version of the source code, or a binary made from the source code, or some other thing like that? Questions? Yes, go ahead.
If I copy the software under GPL, and after some time, some other people contributed it, so can I just change the license from GPL to other?
That's a very good question. So his question is, if he publishes some software and puts a GPL license on it, and at some point he receives contributions from other people and merges those in to his software and continues publishing it under the GPL, can he then later change the license on the whole package of software to something other than the GPL? Anybody want to venture a guess? Not you, because you know the answer. Yes. Oh, wait, you came in late. Are you an expert and a lawyer and stuff?
No.
Oh, okay, all right. So,
I just think to have to know that I think he needs permission from each of
That's-
the authors that made major contributions.
that's essentially correct. So when you received those contributions, you don't have the copyright on those contributions. The people who wrote them do. And so it actually depends on how you receive the contributions. In the simplest case, for example, which is what happens on GitHub all the time now, you have your code sitting there, someone forks your repository into their namespace, works on their changes for a while, sends you a pull request, you go look at it and you go, hey, that's cool, yep, great, thanks, and you merge it in, and now there's this combined version that's in your repository with their stuff and your stuff in it. In that scenario, they have contributed their changes to you under the GPL, because that's the license that was on the code originally, and it gets into the whole derivative work thing, but their changes are derived from your original code, so by default they're under the same license, and in the absence of any statement to the contrary, they will be under that license, and you can't change the license on it without their permission. Now, you will come across a number of open source projects, including lots of prominent ones, that want to give themselves the latitude to be able to change licenses later. And there's a number of ways you can do that. For example, you'll see a notable number of projects that use the GPL will say GPL version 2 or later, which means that anyone, including you and anyone else, could decide to distribute that under GPL version 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever versions come down the line from the Free Software Foundation in the future. That's the narrowest possible way to do it. Then there are projects that require some sort of agreement to accept contributions. And it'll be some form you have to fill out on a website, or some cases it's a PDF you have to download and fill out, print out and sign, and then scan an email or fax or something. And those, the purpose of all of those is to give the receiving project more permissions than they would get by just having it be a derivative work. And they do that for a number of reasons. Some projects do it because they publish the code under multiple licenses. Like there are some companies that publish their code under both an open source license and a commercial license, and they charge for the commercial version. Well, they wouldn't be able to do that if you didn't give them permission to distribute your code under that commercial license. So that's one thing that those agreements are used for. And the others, sometimes the agreements, for example, in the case of the Apache Foundation, their agreements are just so that it is an explicit statement that you agree to these, those are the terms you're contributing under. It goes so far as to some projects, not very many, but notably the ones operated by the Free Software Foundation, they require copyright assignment. If you want to contribute to a Free Software Foundation project like GCC, for example, or GNU Emacs, or a number of others, they will not accept your contributions until after you've signed a form saying, not only am I giving you You're not giving them permission to use the code. You are literally giving them the code. It becomes their property. Now, they do that for a very they do that for a very justifiable reason. Not because they want to be able to relicense it, although they have used that ability and occasionally, and like for example, GCC went from GPL version 2 to GPL version 3, and they were able to do that unilaterally because they had the copyright on all the code in GCC, or the parts of it that mattered. They do it because if they find a violation out there, if they find someone who is using that code in violation of the license, if they are the sole copyright holder, they can go sue whoever that is that they believe is violating the license terms, and the judge or arbitrator or mediator or whoever's involved isn't going to come back and say, well, you're just one of 10,000 copyright holders. What gives you permission to go sue this person? You're going to need to get 10 or 100 or 50%, heaven forbid, of the copyright holders to all join this lawsuit before I will actually let it proceed. And while I don't know that that situation's ever occurred, they're pretty smart and said, we're going to just avoid the possibility of that ever happening by requiring people to give us copyright on their contributions. So there are multiple ways that can happen. An interesting related question which comes up sometimes is, let's say you even in a case where you haven't gotten contributions, all right? You've pushed some code out to GitHub, you've put a GPL license on it, it's been out there for a year, and then you finally say, wait a minute, or no, let's say originally you published it under a more permissive license, like the Apache license or an MIT license or something like that. And then you find out, after it's been out there for a while, that there are users of it that have embedded it into products and are making money off of that and are not making the source code available to the people who they give the products to. And you go, crap, I really didn't think about that, and I don't like that very much. So you decide that you're going to change to a license that stops them from doing that, like the GPL or something like that. So then I get these questions all the time. Can I do that? Well, sure. I mean, you have the copyrights. You can change the license at any time you wish, but you can't do it retroactively. All the versions that you previously published were all under the Apache license, and you can't undo that. It's all been done already. So, yes?
Quick question on that. So all the people that have taken a copy under that license have it. If you then remove all of your copies...
Absolutely. If you were to stop distributing, in that scenario, you would strive to stop distributing any further copies with the previous license on them, because you've decided to change licenses for a reason, and you don't want anybody to be able to get further copies with the more permissive license on it.
But if that license originally granted this evil person the permission to distribute copies under that license...
They can make as many copies as they want. That's right. And anybody who wants to can make as many copies as they want. So we had an interesting discussion with someone in our company, actually, a couple weeks ago after a training session about this, and he said, so let's go through that scenario. You used GitHub to publish your code, and you worked on it for a year, and you push stuff out there every few days. So there's lots and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of commits in your commit history on GitHub. And maybe you made tags when you made releases, and you made tarballs, and you used GitHub to publish those tarballs and all that other stuff, and all that's great, right? And then you decide you're going to change the license, and you go, well, all right, I'm going to take down all the tarballs that have the old license because I don't want people to be able to get those from me anymore. They can get them from other people because the license says they can, but at least I don't want to make the problem any worse by continuing to distribute them myself. And he said, well, what about all the history? I said, that's a very good point, because if I know the commit ID of any commit anywhere in the history of your code on GitHub, I can clone your repository to that exact point in time because it's a unique marker for that commit. And when I do, the copy of the code that GitHub sends down to my computer, guess what license it's going to have in it? The old one. Because that's what was in there in the history. I mean, it's what it was 7 months ago or whatever it was, whichever version So I said, realistically, if you did want to do that and you wanted to stop the ability for people to get more copies from you under the old license, you'd actually have to just truncate the history off and start a new repository. Because otherwise the stuff is there. And that doesn't happen very often, but projects do occasionally change licenses. It's not usually such a big change, but it does happen. That was a long answer, but hopefully that was informative.
You can use, because you can do non-pass forward pushes to GitHub, you can use filter branch to replace your license everywhere.
Sure, you could.
If you want to.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you have to change all the content of all the commits, though.
Yeah.
So, yeah. At which point,
You might anger anybody.
yeah, you would definitely anger anyone who's already got a clone of your repository. But making a new repository that starts from a new point is going to do that too. So either way, one or the other. So, yes, sir. Oh, go ahead.
Is there a rule about how easy it is to access something? If Bob says, okay, you can have this if you make sure that the preferred editable version is also published. Is it sufficient that he has this on the bulletin board at the university cafeteria in Podunk University, Idaho?
That's a good question, isn't it?
Or can he take that formula and put it in, go to the CDC and put it in the vat with the active smallpox virus?
That's right, right.
I mean,
Right.
how easy or difficult should it be? I mean,
So that's a very good question. So his statement is, all right, so if you've decided that the license you're going to use is going to obligate recipients of your code to also have to distribute your source code to other people when they distribute modified versions or whatever they might distribute, and you've wisely chosen the route that says they must distribute the preferred form for editing and not some obfuscated version that no one can understand that's been translated into 5 languages along the path and nothing makes sense anymore. Cool, that was a smart move. But then you have to think about, well, how are they going to give them a copy of the code? I mean, are they just going to say, what's the thing from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? It's on display in the bottom of a locked filing cabinet in the basement of a disused lavatory in the basement after a sign that says, beware of the lion or something. Is that acceptable? Probably not. If your goal was to ensure that everyone would receive a copy of your source code, you're going to want to make provisions for that to happen. So if you go look at something like the GPL, it has provisions for that. There are basically 2 major ones. One covers, let's say, because we're not lawyers, non-commercial usage. In non-commercial usage, you're generally allowed to say the source code's over there. And the source code it's a link to some website somewhere that you expect to be up for a while, some reasonable, I think it says 3 years or something, after the distribution and stuff like that. That's fine. For anything that constitutes commercial usage, like you were being paid for the product or you somehow derived revenue, I mean, there's a lot of wide latitude what constitutes commercial usage. You can't do just that. You have to either include the source code with the delivery of the modified version. So, for example, if you were shipping someone a phone and the binaries are on the phone, then one of your 2 options would be that you include the source code, either on the phone, probably not, probably on something that was shipped with the phone, a flash drive or a DVD or something. And there are companies that choose that route. The other route is that you must include a written offer that someone can exercise to obtain a copy of the software, and you're allowed to charge a nominal fee for copying and shipping and handling and stuff like that. And that's what companies frequently do. Although a lot of them now will just say, the written offer is here, you can get it on a CD or a flash drive or whatever, here are the options, email us at this address, go to our website and ask. By the way, the source code's also on our website. So even though they couldn't rely on it only being available on their website, there's another reason they can't also publish it there if they want to. And then that usually satisfies whoever it is that wants the source code that it's available. So, as you can imagine, those kinds of provisions are the reasons why iOS does not contain any GPL licensed software. And most of Android does not contain any GPL licensed software because nobody who ships phones would want to deal with that. Partly because the people receiving the phones would have absolutely no clue whatsoever any of this meant. But you will, now that you've learned some stuff about this, the next time you get a chance, how many of you are Android device users? Some other people iOS device users? I don't know if this is true so much on iOS, but it's certainly true on Android. If you go into the settings panel and go to About Phone, you will see an item in there that'll either say licenses or legal or notices or something like that. And if you click it, you will see page upon page upon page of these attribute and license notices for all the stuff that's in there that's open source software that requires the attribution be maintained. And they're doing it because that's what the license says they have to do. Now, it's a very low burden once you've built a system to gather up these notices from all of your source code and just include them into the package that you deliver to people. It's not a particularly big deal. But there are companies who have failed to do that. They don't even include the notices in the product. And some licenses require you to include the notices in the product even though they don't require you to ship source code. And so then they get slapped on the hand for not including the notices in the product either. So it's fun. Yes, you had a question. Yes. Okay.
So at that point, now your code is available to everybody and nobody can touch the code before that?
Correct. So if you were publishing the code under a no license or a statement that said all rights reserved, which are effectively the same thing, one's implicit, the other's explicit, during that entire time, nobody had permission to do anything with your code except read it on whatever place you decided to publish it. And if it was possible to use it there, they could use it there, but then they wouldn't be able to use it in any way that required making a copy of it. If you then later decide, oh crap, I really did actually want people to be able to copy this and do stuff with it, and you put a license on it, that's also not retroactive. It only applies from the moment that you put the license on it and going forward. The previous versions, still under whatever license they had, even if that was no license when you published them. Yep. Yes, sir.
Let's say I make open source library. So I suddenly I found out some company makes some patents using my library. So is there a way I can forbid that from making a patent using my code?
So your question is related to how patents interact with some of this stuff. Now keep in mind that patents and copyrights kind of go together and they don't overlap, but they certainly can interact. Patents cover ideas to a greater or lesser extent. In the US, sometimes that line is fairly blurry, and that's the intent, though, is that they cover ideas and not the expression of an idea. So as an example, if you come up with, well, in this case, we'll use Bob's example. So Bob, and you might have missed part of it because I think you came in late, but Bob created some algorithm, and he also wrote a program that implements that algorithm. Technically, that's two things. He's got the idea, the algorithm itself, some way of taking some set of parameters and doing something with them and arriving at a result. Although if it's purely math, that's not patentable either, but let's assume for the moment it is patentable subject matter. He also wrote code that does that. Now, let's say Bob publishes the source code. He also, his master's thesis is a paper that he published, right? It's got the algorithm in it and a description of how the algorithm works and all the experiments he did to prove that it actually does what it's supposed to do and all that kind of stuff. Let's assume for the moment that Bob does not get a patent on the algorithm. He has his copyright on the source code and he's distributed under whatever license he's distributed under. But then you go read the paper and you go, wow, that's really cool. That algorithm is great, but I can't use a C++ implementation. I need it in Haskell because that's what my system is written in, and fine. So you go write a new version of the, you go write code in Haskell that implements the identical algorithm and does exactly the same computations. Well, first, there's no copyright violation because that's a completely independent expression, and anybody who looks at a C++ version and a Haskell version is going to go, yeah, these are, clearly these are not the same thing. They might do the same thing, but that's not what copyright is about. Copyright is about, are they the same thing? And they're not the same thing. So then Bob would say, well, crap. So now in this case, he wanted his algorithm out in the world anyway, so he's probably not going to have pursued a patent on it. So to get back to your question, if you publish some code that is an expression of an idea that hasn't been published before, the idea itself, in addition to the code, has not something that's been published before, and some company sees that and goes, wow, that's really cool. If we had a patent on that idea, we'd be able to make billions of dollars because lots of people are going to want to do this thing. And they go apply for a patent, and given the way the patent systems tend to work in the world, they'll probably get it because that's just how it goes. And you discover that, it's pretty easy now to go back to whichever patent office issued them the patent, US or UK or Germany or whatever it is, and say, yeah, my code was out there 9 months before they even applied for their patent. You can go look at it. It's prior art. It shows exactly what this algorithm is and how it works. And it's almost guaranteed their patent will be invalidated. Now, you might not be interested in doing that, partly because it's time consuming and it can be costly. But if they were to attempt to sue someone with their newly won patent, and that someone that they're suing has any kind of clue or has an attorney with any kind of clue, they're going to do exactly the same thing. They're going to go try to find out, is there any way we can invalidate this patent? Because that's the fastest way to just stop the lawsuit in its tracks. It never gets to extensive discovery or juries or any of that kind of stuff. They just cut it off, and they'll find that too. There are also websites now, one called askpatents.org, where people, it's a Stack Exchange kind of thing, except it's for people to try to help crowdsource finding prior art. Someone will say, hey, I've been sued for blah, 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 and boy, it would be great if I could find some prior art that shows that this patent is just bogus. And there's people out there who, just like people who will spend every hour they're not working answering C++ questions on Stack Overflow, there are people out there who will say, all right, I'm going to go spend Saturday and I'm going to find some prior art for this patent, and they'll go do it. And there's a lot of patents that have been shot down because of stuff that was found that way. So yeah, that's why I said I really wasn't going to. Patents are so complicated, and the system is so badly broken in the US, it's crazy, but yeah. So, in fact, now in the US, thank you, with the most recent legislation related to patents, it's actually possible for anyone to ask the patent office to review a patent that's been issued. Even if they haven't been sued about it, they're not a patent holder or anything else, you can basically just send them a letter, or however the mechanism is, and say, I believe this claim and this patent should not have been issued, and here's why, and you give them whatever evidence you have and links to wherever it is, and they'll go review it, and if it turns out that they agree with your statement that it's invalid, they'll just proactively contact the patent owner and say, by the way, that part of your patent's no longer valid, and thanks. So, and that's beginning to happen now. So, yep. Yes, sir.
What if you kind of want to extend the license? So let's say I'm an academia and I publish my software, and I would like everybody that uses my software to cite my research paper. And usually you add like a note, if you use the software, please cite paper, blah, 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 people do it. But is there like a way to enforce it? Can you like add something to the license without screwing with it? Or?
So your question is, basically, what sorts of obligations can you place on the people who are going to redistribute your software? As we talked about, well, it's difficult to place obligations on people who use the software, although that can be done too. But if you do so, your license won't be considered to be open source anymore because you're not allowed to do that, except in some very rare cases. So we mostly focus on the distribution part because that's what open source licenses are really about, is distribution. You can do anything you want. You can require anything you want. And I won't go try to bring it up here because it'll take too long, but make yourself a note, mental if you have to. Are you German, by the way?
Yes.
Okay. I don't remember. Okay, that's right. We talked about that the other day. I will not attempt to pronounce the name of it, but there is a German song whose title basically translates to the chicken dance in English. It's really hilarious. There is a license out there called the Chicken Dance License, which says for something like every 1,000 copies of the software that you distribute, 10% of the team that's producing and distributing the software must listen to the Chicken Dance song for 2 minutes. And then it gets more and more. If you distribute more and more copies, it scales up, and it's really hilarious. It is not in any way considered to be an open source license because it's so ridiculous. But you could choose to put any kind of obligations you want in a license that you draft. Now, I made that last point on purpose. There are some licenses, notably the GPL, that do not allow you to add additional restrictions or obligations at all. You cannot. Because if you do, the license is no longer the GPL. It's the GPL plus some additional restriction. You can give people additional permission, and there are projects who do that. So for example, there may be, in a project that I used to work on, the software was distributed under the GPL version 2. It uses a library that has a license that is sort of incompatible with the GPL, although that's changing, but for now that's the case. And yet we did not want to stop people from distributing those two together. Using them together, of course, is fine because it's not distribution, but we didn't want someone from being restricted from distributing them together. So our license was the GPL plus permission to link to this one specific library under this one specific license, and that's perfectly fine. But if you put an additional restriction on, like I mentioned trademarks before when you asked about IP. So there's a lot of open source projects that are, especially ones that are backed by companies, that the name is trademarked. The name of the project is actually a registered trademark in various parts of the world. It's an open question as to whether they can stop you from using the trademark on a version of their software that you've distributed, even if you've modified it, which is what trademarks are supposed to be for. You're not supposed to be able to modify something or make it different or whatever and still use the trademark. The trademark is supposed to indicate quality and purity and coming from the original source and all that kind of stuff, except if your open source license stops you from putting additional restrictions on it, you can't. You can't tell them they have to change the name of the software, otherwise it's not that license anymore. That's actually something that a lot of open source lawyers are still trying to work out, exactly how that needs to be dealt with, because trademarks exist and a lot of open source projects benefit from them. Mozilla, for example, is a very common, or a very well-known example that Firefox is a registered trademark of the Mozilla Foundation. I think Thunderbird, when used for email software, is also a registered trademark of the Mozilla Foundation. And so their license, which is not the GPL, by the way, it's a Mozilla public license, but it does have some trademark-related restrictions in it. If you make, there's certain types of changes you're allowed to make to the software and still call it Firefox, but if you go outside the scope of those changes, you're not allowed to call it Firefox anymore. That's why in Debian it's not called Firefox, because the Debian people said, well, we're not going to constrain ourselves to that little box. If we decide we want to backport a security fix from some other version that the Mozilla team has not done, or we want to make some change that they aren't even going to incorporate for a year, we are going to give ourselves latitude to do that, and that means we're not going to call it Firefox. So they have to remove all the Firefox branding from it.
I think it's kind of more, at least my reading of it, it's more that if they give you Firefox, the user, and the source code, you as the user can't make those modifications. So even if Debian didn't want to make a non-committed modification, it's the fact that they're giving, the Debian philosophy is that users must be able to change everything.
Oh yes, of course, right. So, but it all derives from that trademark issue, that they don't want any restriction on the users of Debian from being able to further distribute and modify and all those things that violates the DFSG in a pretty strong way. So they went through all the work to do that. And so if you install Debian, not Ubuntu, because Ubuntu has a separate deal with Mozilla, but if you install Debian and you go apt-get install Firefox, it's going to say, there's no such thing called Firefox here. Would you like Iceweasel? Oh, okay, sure. And you get Iceweasel, and it's almost exactly the same thing as Firefox. It doesn't have the Firefox logo or the name or any of that other stuff in it. So yeah, that's fun. So yes, you can do that. I have seen lots of licenses that have very easy to comply with additional restrictions like that, and people just say, fine, whatever. There are others that are significantly more difficult. OpenSSL is one. Thankfully, the OpenSSL team is now finally moving away from that license, and to go back to this gentleman's question, in order for them to do it, they have to confirm that they have adequate permission to be able to change the license on OpenSSL, which is a big project, but they are doing it. Their license for the longest time has had a clause in it that says if you use OpenSSL in a product and you advertise that product, and the advertising for your product refers to any features of your product that derive from the capabilities that using OpenSSL gave you, then the advertising itself must include a statement that says this product uses OpenSSL, blah, 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 blah. That means marketing brochures, websites, whatever. And so that means that companies who make products that have OpenSSL in them avoid that by never referring to those features because they don't want to have to say, oh crap, we forgot to include that statement on the 10,000 marketing brochures we just had printed. So now they're moving away from that license to the Apache license, so that won't be an issue anymore. But that's been a fun one for a lot of companies. My prior employer had to deal with that too. And the products they wanted to say, oh, implements, TLS and secure this and secure that, and we go, but it wouldn't have that if it didn't have OpenSSL in it, which means the OpenSSL team could make us include that statement on our advertising. They probably wouldn't, but they could. And so from a risk management point of view, you have to go for your safest route, which is fine, we'll include the freaking statement on the website. So anyway, I think we're just about out of time, right? All right, well, they're not going to kick us out right away, but one more? So your question is related to, I'm going to rephrase your question because it partially covers what he asked before, but it actually brings in another thing. So there is something called, I'm trying to remember the exact wording, I believe it's called a compilation copyright. So think about, for example, an academic journal that has 20 papers in it they're all copyrighted by the authors of those papers. Yet when you receive a copy of that journal, if you happen to get one on paper, and you look inside, it will say copyright 2015 Springer Verlag Academic Publications, or whatever the name of the publisher is. And you go, well, wait a minute, how can that be? Because they didn't write any of these papers. The only part of this thing that they have that they are the copyright holders of is the content on the cover. The rest of it is all stuff that came from other people. How can that be? There is a kind of copyright called compilation copyright, which is you get some copyright ownership in the fact that you collected all of those works together and are publishing them together. And that's used for things like that. It's used for albums, for example, music albums where there are those 18 songs all written by different artists, performed by different artists, et cetera, and yet the music label or some producer or somebody will have a copyright on the collection as a whole. When they do that, it means that, to go back to the journal example because that's easier, if one of the papers in there has a license in it that says freely redistributable or some other, whatever, make as many copies as you want, to use a really non-legalese license. Someone who receives a copy of that journal could make as many copies of that paper from the journal as they want and distribute them to anybody they want. They cannot copy the entire journal as a unit because the publisher has the copyright on the thing as a group, as a whole. In open source projects, that's also true. So your efforts in deciding what should go into your project actually give you some rights into the project as a whole. So let's say you, so the example I like to use because it's pretty easy, you write a library, you publish it on GitHub, doesn't have any unit tests because you abhor unit tests, So someone comes along and says, wow, this thing is awesome, but man, it would be so good if it had unit tests. So I'm going to contribute a whole set of unit tests. A framework, it's all going to drop into a test subdirectory. It'll have it's all new code that they wrote. Doesn't have any, I mean, you know, it's unit tests, right? It doesn't have any code from your library, and it just exercises your library. And you look at that and you go, all right, fine, you did all the work, great. I'll merge it, but I'm not ever going to maintain it. You're going to have to maintain it because you're that way. So now, you have the copyright on all the library, and they have the copyright on all the unit test stuff because neither of you have code in other people's source files. And yet, you are the one who is distributing the whole thing as a unit, which means you get some. Now, the licenses that we're talking about here don't generally apply to that. They usually apply to the individual works themselves and not the whole thing. So, for example, if the person who sent you those unit tests said, well, I'm going to give you all these unit tests, but even though you licensed the library under the Apache license, I'm going to put the GPL on all the unit tests. And you look at that and you go, well, because this actually happens. And you go, well, I guess that's all right, because you know, if someone's going to distribute a binary of my library, that's okay. I wanted them to be able to do that. That's why I gave them the Apache license permissions in the first place. They're not very likely to distribute binaries of the unit tests. I mean, that's kind of a weird thing for someone to want to do. And so putting the GPL on it really isn't going to stop them from using my library. They'll compile the unit tests in their build system, and they'll use them to make sure that everything's built correctly. And then they'll distribute the final library binary, and they won't distribute the unit test binaries at all. So fine, that's fine. I'll take your code, and even though it says GPL2 all over it, you can't put a file at the top that says this whole project is Apache 2 licensed. You can't override the license of the stuff that they gave you just because you have a license on the whole thing. So it's there, but there's not a whole lot you can really do with it because the licenses really apply to the actual files with their content in them. So. And with that, we should probably call it quits. I think everybody's tired. I know I'm tired. Thank you very much. Hopefully this was educational. Yeah, thanks.